What's up, guys? My name is Awakend, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make massive supersaw stacks. I made a project file to illustrate this point, so let's dive in. So this is probably one of the questions that I get asked most often by producers. So my goal with this video is to show you that making giant supersaw stacks is actually much simpler than you might think. So I'll break this down into what I would consider the sort of essential pieces. So I'll give you guys kind of a list of what layers I'm using, and then I'll kind of explain each layer in depth, how I made it, and kind of what it's doing. So within the context of the stack bus, we've got 3 saw layers, we've got a white noise, and then we've got 2 mid-bass layers. So within the supersaws, generally the way that I would layer this, the way that I would recommend it, is one super wide, heavily detuned layer. And then from there, we have another also wide, less detuned layer that's going to be a little bit more kind of textured, distorted, gritty. This is what's going to give the saw stack a little bit more characteristic. Next, we've got the kind of more narrow, gritty saw. So it's going to sit in the middle of the mix. It's going to be a bit warmer, a little bit more kind of gritty and maybe distorted and saturated. Again, from there, we've just got a pure white noise source. After that, we've got a very wide mid-bass and a very narrow mid-bass. Next, we've got a super wide reverby screamy lead, and then we've got a more kind of upfront, dry, no reverb, slightly more mono kind of crunchy lead that has a bit more tonality and presence. After that, we've got 2 atmosphere layers, and then we've got a sub, and some drums. So as you guys can already kind of see, not a ton of crazy stuff going on in here. Let's break down these layers a little bit more individually. So this super wide saw layer, this is probably like the biggest main saw layer. As you can see, super simple. It's just basically 2 detuned saws with slightly different detune amounts, 0.23 and 0.14. Little bit of processing. Nothing super crazy, mainly just a shelf that's kind of boosting the high end here. So then if we look at the post-processing, basically there's just some EQs, right? So if I turn these off, really what I'm doing is I'm cutting the high end off of the like 11K and above range to make room for the white noise, getting rid of a little bit of harshness in the mid-range, cutting away some mud in the sides using a mid-side EQ. When I say mud, generally I mean frequencies between, let's say, 100 hertz and 450 hertz, typically centering around 250 hertz. Again, a little bit of harshness, decrease, and then a little bit of low-end roll-off here, making space for the mid-basses. So I have my low cut set at 104, and then I have a dip at about 160. And then I'm also doing a boost of the stereo width. So this is an Ableton plugin. You can do this in any DAW or you can use a stereo imager, but I'm basically taking the stereo width and just pushing it super wide so it feels like it's just like way out in the stereo field. So next up, we've got the Chaos Saw. AU5 made a great YouTube tutorial for this. I highly recommend you guys go check that out. He's using a different method to create supersaws here. You can see the unison is just set to 1. He's using the chaos matrix inside of Serum. So things are being done a little bit differently here, but this is how this layer sounds. So really kind of gritty, screamy, it has this really cool texture to it that a normal supersaw doesn't really have. And then I'm also, again, I'm boosting the stereo width here, not quite as much, 170 instead of 217 in the case of this upper supersaw here. But then using a mid-side EQ, I'm taking away like all of the low end from the mono of this layer, and that's going to make room for this narrow kind of gritty saw down below. So if I turn off this low cut in the mono, taking that low end away from the mono really takes that saw and just pushes it way out wide, so you perceive it as being much wider because there's just nothing going on in the center. So then that brings us down to the center supersaw here. Again, super simple in its construction. If I turn off oscillators A and B, you'll notice most of the power and volume here is literally just coming from a single saw wave, a single voice saw wave sub oscillator. Oscillators A and B, they simply add a little bit of texture and a little bit of stereo width so that this doesn't just sound like a stock saw wave. No processing inside of Serum. After that, I've got A little bit of EQing, if I turn that off, it sounds like this. You know, it's doing quite a bit, right? I'm taking off some high end here, reducing some mid-range kind of muddiness. And then a big thing here is I'm doing, again, mid-side EQ. And this is reducing low end in the mono, but it's really severely reducing low end in the sides. Let me take that off and show you. Right, and so these two, like this chaos saw and this narrow, these two fit together kind of like a puzzle piece as a result of that. So they're both kind of doing different things in the mix. You know, the chaos saw is really wide and noisy and screamy. The narrow gritty saw, it's really mono and kind of warm and present. And the other thing about this narrow gritty saw that's important is I do have some saturators on here, right? So if I turn those off, you know, without the saturators, it just sounds really stock and kind of plain. With the saturators, there's just a lot more texture, warmth, harmonics, you know, it's more present, all that kind of stuff. So then the white noise here, literally just a white noise from a Cashmere sample pack. I've been using the same exact white noise sample for like 8 years. I have two mid basses, like I mentioned, a wide mid bass, nothing crazy, detuned super saw, and then some hyperdimension and some chorus. And then again, the EQing here is super important, right? So I'm taking away mud from the sides, 170 and then 280, give or take. That stuff tends to get pretty muddy in wide mid basses, in super saws, you know, anything that's kind of wide and has low frequencies, it tends to get a bit muddy out there. So I'm usually cutting. I'm boosting the stereo width again by a bit. And then again, I'm taking away lots of mono low end, similar to what I was doing with the Chaos Saw, because this layer is meant to be wide, doesn't need to have a lot of mono. And I have the mono mid bass down below here, filling in that kind of narrow stuff. And so again, these two kind of fit together like a puzzle piece. Because this wide mid bass does have mono presence, if I turn these cuts off, right, it just doesn't need all that mono presence. And when you add a separate mono layer, it just ends up sounding a lot more powerful and a lot more interesting. Rather than just having one single mid bass that takes up the whole frequency spectrum, you can do that. It just doesn't end up sounding nearly as interesting. A big mistake that I see producers making with mid basses is they either have too few, they have too many, they're playing too high of an octave, or they're just low cutting their mid basses too aggressively, right? So if you take a look at like this mono mid bass, I have the low cut set to about 80. That's pretty typical for me. I see a lot of producers doing this and they're cutting all the way up to like 200 hertz, but you end up losing the power of that mid bass by doing that. You know, you're cutting too much off of the mid bass. You want that low end. You don't need sub, right? So you don't need that stuff down there in that 30, 40, 50 hertz range, but you do need bass. And the bass frequency range sits somewhere between about 70 to like 120, roughly speaking, give or take. You need those frequencies, right? And so if you don't have that low end, this mid bass just sort of gets lost in the super saw stack. And so these two mid basses fit together really nicely. And if you listen to this whole stack, kind of with and without mid basses, you know, it makes a really big difference, right? So those mid basses are essential for a really big super saw stack. You know, when you're thinking about a big saw stack, it is, yes, it's about the saws, but it's also about the basses and it's also about the leads. So that brings me to the next point, which is my leads. So with leads, I've kind of gone back and forth over the years about this topic. Many of the songs that I've released have somewhere between 5 and 10 lead layers. Now that I know what I know, I would probably argue that's too many. I mean, you can do it, but it's just going to be a big pain for you to do it that way. You know, it's going to be a big pain to have all those extra layers. So what I think you absolutely do need is at least 2 layers, right? Just 2 of them. So the way that I do these layers, I have one really wide, really reverby and screamy lead layer that sounds like this. By the way, shout out to remnant.exe. This guy is a wizard. Go check out his Serum presets on his Gumroad website. They are incredible. Highly recommend. But as you can see, it's just basically very hyper detuned saw waves with distortion, multi-band compression, EQ, and reverb. Again, pushing the stereo width using this utility, pushing that up to 167%, so it goes way out into the stereo field. And then this other layer I have here, this is my more kind of upfront, gritty, somewhat dry layer. So there's no reverb on this layer. It's a lot more upfront because of that. And this is what it looks like. Very simple. Detuned saw waves, nothing super crazy going on here. And then I have a bit of processing inside of Serum. They're all doing a little bit of work here. There's delay because there's more of a signal then being fed into the distortion, which creates a sort of grittier, more textured sound, which I'm a big fan of. So that's kind of what that delay is doing with the distortion. Nothing else really going on. Taking off a little bit of high end with a high cut, taking off some harshness, really bright leads, super saws. They tend to get really harsh in like the 2K to 4K range. So that's why I'm cutting some 2K and I'm cutting some 3.6K there. I'm also cutting off some stuff on the sides using a mid-side EQ to make more room for the wide leads so that these two sit nicely together. A small thing to mention, this lead is playing staccato notes, meaning they're chopped, dun, 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 rather than just sustained. That's another form of contrast that can be helpful for making these big stacks. And then this lead also has harmonies. So instead of just playing single notes, and these notes generally belong to the chord that's playing beneath in one of these super saw layers, so you don't have to overthink that. But yeah, these two lead layers, I would say, are the sort of essential lead layers. You can always add more than that. There's nothing wrong with it. You just don't need to overdo it. The whole point of this tutorial is to show you guys how simple this can really be. Hey guys, so I just wanted to interrupt the video here for a quick little 30-second message. I wanted to mention my mentorship program, which is known as Awakend Academy. If you're a producer who makes melodic bass, melodic dubstep, future bass, progressive trance, anything in those realms, then I recommend that you check out the link down below in my bio, which tells you all about Awakend Academy. My goal with this mentorship program is to help you create, finish, and release professional quality music consistently, stuff that you're really proud of. Many of my students have already gotten amazing results. They have awesome testimonials and really positive things to say overall. So if this sounds interesting at all to you, please check out the link down below in my bio. And without further ado, let's get back to the video. So moving on then up to the atmospheres. And you notice they're not sidechained. They're very thin, and they really don't need sidechain in my opinion. It actually makes the overall drop just feel like bigger. It gives it a much more kind of wide sense of depth. And when you look at these atmospheres, I'm doing a lot of low cutting, right? So I'm removing all of the low end and all of the mid-range frequency from these. If I turn that off, there's just all this extra like rumble and stuff on the low end that I don't need. So I typically am doing this with my atmospheres. I thin them out and then I turn them up as loud as I can before they become distracting. So let me just kind of show you like the drop with and without these. It's subtle, especially if you're listening on an iPhone, but if you're listening on like studio speakers or like decent headphones or even just like earbuds, this should be pretty obvious. And it really does make a difference. Like when you turn them off, the drop, it still feels pretty big, but it's just missing that extra sort of like giant space that feels like it's kind of in the background, right? And so these layers are great for that. So then after that, all we've got left in terms of synths is my sub. This is also very simple. This is how my sub sounds at the moment. And if you look at Serum, what this is, it's literally just a sine wave. And then if you use a little pencil tool inside of Serum here, I've just drawn in custom harmonics. So which is why when you see it on the EQ here, it's not just a sine wave, right? There's little harmonics that come up above that. And then I just feed that into a saturator. You can use any tube saturator or distortion unit. You could use a Serum Effects if you're in FL Studio. And it just gives it a little bit more harmonics. This is a mistake that I see a lot of producers making. I see this all the time. Would not recommend it. I don't think you need to filter the high end off of your sub. I think keeping some of those harmonics is a good thing, right? I mean, if your sub looked like this, then you might want to filter some of that off, because then it's this weird, fuzzy, messy thing. But your sub shouldn't look like that, in my opinion. It should look like this. Strong, fundamental harmonics kind of rolling off up to about 800 hertz. No need to filter, no need to EQ, just leave it as is. I've tried every sub I could possibly try over the years, and I've come to the conclusion that the simpler, the better. So another point that I want to get across, again, trying to show you guys how simple this really actually can be. If you look at my bus for the stack, so this has all my super saws and all my mid basses and noise and stuff like that inside of it, there's basically nothing on it. These are just side chains. And then beyond that, I just have an OTT set to 15%, which if I turn it off, it makes a tiny difference to sort of compress the low end and mid range and then kind of like brighten up the highs a little bit, but it's very minor. A mistake that I think I see a lot of producers making is, a lot of people, when I help them out on lessons, when I help them out on my mentorship program, I'll look at their project files and they have layers that are about right, but then their bus has like 19 different plugins on it. It's OTTs, it's decapitators, there's distortion units, there's like all kinds of different crazy things. And more often than not, when we end up turning off all those plugins, it actually sounds better at the end of the day than it does with the plugins on. So I'm not here to convince you that you should never be using bus processing. I'm not here to convince you that you shouldn't use plugins. I'm just saying you can make it sound really good without any of that. And so my point is, if you overprocess and you have too many plugins, it's going to make your life super difficult. It tends to be really, really difficult to like make changes and have it be noticeable when you're feeding stuff into a super long effect chain. So by all means, use as many plugins as you want to, but I recommend only doing so if you really know what those plugins are doing and you can say confidently that, yes, this actually sounds better with these plugins than without. If you're just processing to process for the sake of processing, I would recommend against it and just turn all that stuff off. Simple works great. Same thing with these leads, right? It's just a little bit of multiband compression. That's it. On the atmospheres, there's no processing. There's just an EQ. With the sub, same thing. Nothing crazy going on. And even with my drums, there's nothing on the bus. There's nothing on the kick. The only thing on my snare is a transient shaper, which is a free kilohertz plugin. It's barely adding a little bit of front end transient. So it's really minor. It just gives it a little bit more of a sharp kind of feeling to the transient. I've got some splashy percussion and a ride. And that's it. So again, I'm not saying don't use plugins, but my point is you can get drums sounding really good by just choosing solid samples. You don't need a crazy compression. You don't need kick tight. You don't need OTTs. You don't need decapitators and distortion units and all this kind of crazy stuff. These drums slap, and it's because they're great samples. The Chime Ace Aura Melodic Rhythm Pack is where I got these drums from, and then just a Cashmere Ride from a Cashmere sample pack. Keeping things simple works shockingly well most of the time if you have good sound selection. So that's the tutorial, guys. I hope you found it helpful. Again, my goal with this was just to hopefully provide you guys with some really like concrete, actionable advice on how to make a big supersaw stack kind of over and over again. As long as you're sort of following this rough guideline, you think about like a wide saw versus a narrow saw, a wide mid bass versus a narrow mid bass, wide lead versus kind of more narrow and present lead. You can choose different sounds and you can end up with a different saw stack every time. But just use that framework when you're choosing your sounds. If you have any questions or if you really liked this tutorial, please let me know down in the comments. I'm planning on doing more and more of these in the future, so if there's a topic you really want to see, if you don't have any good resources out there, you've never seen a good video for it, there's something you really want me to talk about, also, please let me know down in the comments. So I hope you guys found this helpful. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.